Hello everybody, congratulations, you've made it through to episode 10 of Write This Way, and fittingly we're going to be talking about endings. So yesterday in the post I talked about the beginnings and how when you start writing something you're creating a contract between the writer and those listening and those reading, and of course endings are quite simply where you pay up, where the contract is complete and you're settling the accounts between you. Now that sort of gives you the idea that you have to, in your ending, aim for something which fully satisfies all the expectations that the reader has gathered. I mean, so it's obvious in a story about a crime, you in some way answer the whodunit question, even if you take a novel approach to that. If it's a romance, you resolve whatever tensions there have been in the relationships, and so on like that. So I thought we'd look at some endings from famous books, look what's happened there, and then I'm going to use some examples from my own work, and then I'm going to set you your little bit of homework. So, how does one of the most famous novels in the English language end? I've got here a copy of Jane Eyre. This was actually something I collected as a teenager. It used to come free with a magazine. It was my entry into literature. It's not a scholarly edition, in other words. But anyway, this ends, and I hope I'm not spoiling the plot for anybody. Charlotte Bronte ends her last chapter with, "Reader, I married him." And then the rest of the chapter explains what happens then. So she has satisfied all of that, a marvellous story, the tension, by wedding bells. And that's very often the way a romance ends. Perhaps in a modern novel it might not necessarily be wedding bells, but it'd be whatever the equivalent is. It's the forever friendship, the riding away in the carriage moment, the kiss. So that's one of the ways of expanding on or settling the bill in a story that has a romance at its heart. But there's more in that last chapter than that. A Victorian novel very often does what she does here, which is tells you what happens to each of the characters. It's like a final bow where you see each character going off into their imagined futures. And she actually saves the last word for St. John, who is the character who helps establish her in a school when she has run away, when Jane Eyre has run away from the situation she was in at Thornfield. And it ends on in a sort of quite a high elevated deathbed scene for St. John in the missionary field, and it gives the last word to a sort of "Amen, even so come Lord Jesus." So there's a sort of a pious end to this particular Victorian novel. That's not the famous bit. The famous line is, "Reader, I married him." So that's how you might want to end something in the world of romance, or a classic ending. So what else? Okay, I've mentioned Tolkien several times, coming from the city of Tolkien, that's perhaps to be expected. How does he end Lord of the Rings? Well, Peter Jackson's film was famously criticised for having lots of endings. The last 10 minutes seem to be, is it the end now? Or now? Now? That's because Tolkien's book actually has several moments where it could have ended, but he's not in a hurry to leave his subject. And in fact, I think as a reader, you're not in a hurry to leave the characters either. It's a different account than that's run up by a film, where perhaps you need to go and stretch your legs and go to the loo and things. But in a book, you don't have to worry about that kind of thing. So the actual ending is the same as in the Peter Jackson film. It's Sam coming back from the Grey Havens, and he's saying, as he comes in the door, he drew a deep breath. "Well, I'm back," he said. And that actually has a lovely elegiac closure to it as a story. It doesn't end with the ring going into the fire. It doesn't end with the crowning of Aragorn. It doesn't even end when Frodo comes home, because he can't settle in his home, and he has a sort of greater destiny ahead of him, a heroic destiny, as he goes into the West. But it's Sam who's the everyday figure who roots us in our reality, who is the one who comes home again, which refers back to that idea of it being a journey there and back again, which we heard about in The Hobbit first. So that is one way of ending some kind of epic fantasy. You can either have the heroic destiny of a Frodo, or you can have the down-to-earth Sam coming back in through the front door, or you can have both. So that's another way of ending. And then finally, another book I picked up off the shelf which I really like, which is Kate Atkinson's One Good Turn. It's a comic detective story set in the Edinburgh Festival, which I picked up in Edinburgh once when I was at the festival, and read in situ, which was great. But this has, I'm not going to spoil the crime story ending, the whodunit ending, but it has a very definite last line. And it just says, "Congratulations, Mrs. Hatter," he said. "Our business is concluded." Full stop. So you could end your story with a sense of the business being concluded. Of course, the conclusion of a business in a crime novel is who did it, who gets caught, who gets away with it, those sorts of things. So that's the puzzle that has been solved. That's what you've presented. So those are some 3 endings I've picked out. What about my choice of endings? Well, they vary a lot with the genre that I'm writing in. So one of the very first books I wrote was this one called The Secret of the Sirens, and it's the first part of what turned out to be a quartet. And so the ending of the first part here is a not quite ending. So Cole, Connie and Evelyn set off together down Shaker Row, turning their backs on the sea and the midnight blue shadow that was gathering again where wave meets shore. So unpacking that, what we have here is a sort of characters walking into the sunset feel. That's another way of ending. But the shadow that's gathering again hints to the alert reader that the bad guy, in my book called Kalervo, and blue-black is his colour, he's coming back. So you can do that teaser, shortly part 2. And indeed there is a part 2. And what about romance? Well, I've written a lot of romance over the years, and I've just picked up Stealing Phoenix under my Joss Sterling pen name. And classically, these books end usually on a kiss, because they're YA romance. They only very occasionally do Wedding Bells. It seems a bit premature to do Wedding Bells in a YA romance. And at the end of this, I don't want to spoil the story for those who haven't read, but there is a sense of this is a girl who is lost and has no family. So her end point is he had stolen me out from under the noses of some of the toughest criminals in the world, and he was not planning on handing me back ever. So it's very important to her that she's not going to be thrown back to the wolves again. So that's where the sum is paid up, and hopefully as a reader you find that really satisfying, that you know that finally she has come home in some way, some sense. And then what about doing adult psychological thrillers? Well, again, I don't want to spoil any endings, but without spoiling what happens, I do another Into the Sunset. And this one doesn't have the sense of a return that I had in the other one. On a powder blue moped, winking with shiny possibilities, we ride over Westminster Bridge towards Big Ben and turn west for home. So looking at this, I'm quite often going for the return home theme. That may be just something in my writing that I like, that sense of finding home is a comfort. But of course you might well want to do setting out on an adventure, into somebody is ready to begin life. That's another possibility. So really, endings are just the beginning of thinking of what might happen next. So they're very open, aren't they? And your choice will depend on the content of your story. But my last thing I want to talk about here, and the one takeaway, is I want you to think about getting your end clear in your head before you start writing, in order to have your end point working for you right from the beginning, so that you seed it all the way through and nobody is surprised. Nobody finds the bill is actually £1,000 when they're expecting 100, or vice versa. So if you know, don't just start writing into the dark unless, well, some people do that, but I would advise you not to do that, but have a vague sense of what your ending is going to be, so that you're heading for that destination. The route you take may change, you may surprise yourself by your choices, but try to have your end point in your head. So your homework is to work out what your end is for the piece that you're writing, even if you've only just started on it, so that you can work backwards from that. And of course, another form of homework is to do what I've done. Just go to your favourite novels and think about the choices that were made in them. So thank you for listening. I'm not going to do a daily broadcast anymore because I've found it's been getting in the way of my writing, but I will check back in and do maybe 2 or 3 broadcasts at 2 o'clock during the weeks that we're all in isolation. Anyway, so go away, get writing, see how much you can achieve in this extraordinary time.